The saw-toothed peaks of the Rockies tore at the bruised purple sky, indifferent stone giants that had witnessed 1,000 suns set on human folly. Below, in the dusty artery of Copper Ridge's main street, a different kind of indifference played out. Frank Sullivan, newly arrived, and a giant among ordinary men, felt the grit of the high desert on his teeth as he watched the scene unfold. Two men, their postures a study in casual menace, had cornered a small girl. Frank recognized one of them from the saloon, Jake Mercer, a man whose sneer seemed a permanent fixture on his thin face. The other was just a younger, broader version of the same cruelty. The girl, no older than 7, stood her ground with a stubborn set to her small jaw that reminded Frank of a defiant sapling in a harsh wind. Her wheat blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her patched dress had seen far better days. But her eyes, the color of new spring leaves, held no fear. Only anger. "Just tell us where your ma keeps the deed." Penny Mercer drawled, his voice a low grating sound. "The Colonel is a patient man, but even his patience has limits. This whole thing could be over, and your ma would have a nice bit of coin in her pocket. My mama says this farm is not for sale." The girl announced, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. "She says it's our home." Mercer's smile was a thin, unpleasant line. "Homes can burn. People can get hurt. It would be a shame if a pretty little thing like you got caught in the middle of some unfortunate accident." His gaze flickered to the object clutched in her hand. With a movement as quick as a striking snake, he snatched it from her grasp. "What's this, a little soldier?" It was a crudely carved toy, a Union infantryman, standing at a lopsided attention. The blue of its uniform was faded, the wood worn smooth by small, anxious hands. For the girl, the loss was catastrophic. Her composure shattered, her face crumpled, and a single desperate sob escaped her lips. "Give him back. My papa made him for me." Frank had been an observer, a ghost passing through this town, on his way to a future that had already evaporated. But the sight of the girl's raw distress, the casual cruelty of the man, and the image of that little wooden soldier, it was a combination that struck him with the force of a physical blow. He moved without conscious thought, his long legs covering the distance in 3 silent strides. The floorboards of the boardwalk groaned a protest under his weight. He didn't speak. He simply filled the space, his massive 6'8" frame casting a long skeletal shadow that swallowed Mercer and the girl whole. Mercer turned, his sneer faltering, as he had to crane his neck to look up at the mountain of a man who had appeared from nowhere. Frank's face was a mask of calm, his pale blue eyes holding a quiet authority that was far more intimidating than any overt threat. "The girl wants her toy back," Frank said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. For a moment, Mercer's arrogance held. "This ain't your business, friend." Frank's gaze didn't waver. He simply held out a hand the size of a small ham. The silence stretched thick and heavy with unspoken violence. The second man shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip, but a subtle shake of Mercer's head stopped him. Mercer had spent enough time in barrooms and back alleys to recognize a line that should not be crossed. He tossed the wooden soldier into Frank's waiting hand as if it were a hot coal. Frank knelt, a slow, deliberate movement that made his joints ache. The world shrank to the space between him and the child. He held out the toy. "I believe this is yours, miss." Penny looked up, her tear-streaked face a mixture of awe and relief. She took the soldier, her small fingers closing around it with a fierce possessiveness. As his gaze fell on the crudely carved Union uniform, the world around Frank dissolved. The dusty street, the frightened child, the sullen bullies, they all faded away, replaced by the deafening roar of cannon fire and the acrid smell of smoke and burning pine. He was back in the tangled, hellish woods of the wilderness. The air was thick with the screams of men and horses. A supply wagon, its canvas cover ablaze, had overturned, pinning him beneath a splintered wheel. Flames licked at his legs, the heat searing the pain, a white-hot agony. He was going to die there, cooked alive in his own uniform. Then a face appeared through the smoke, lean, clever, with eyes that missed nothing. Thomas Garrett. A scout, quick and wiry, a man who could move through the dense woods like a ghost. "Hold on, Sullivan." Thomas had yelled, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. Just hold on. Thomas had used a fallen log as a lever, his slight frame straining with impossible effort against the wagon's weight. Frank had felt the pressure ease just enough to drag his mangled leg free. As he crawled away from the flames, he looked back. Thomas was still there, trying to salvage a medical kit from the burning wreckage. A single sharp crack, a sound distinct from the general chaos of battle, and Thomas crumpled a dark stain spreading across the back of his gray-blue uniform. He'd been shot, not by the enemy in front, but by something else, something unseen in the confusion. Frank had tried to go back to pull him out as Thomas had pulled him, but the wagon's ammunition had cooked off in a final devastating explosion, and the world went black. "Mister, are you all right?" The small voice pulled him back to the present. He was still kneeling on the dusty boardwalk of Copper Ridge, and the sun beating down on his neck. Penny Garrett was looking at him, her green eyes filled with a child's simple concern. He blinked, the phantom smell of smoke slowly receding. He saw it now. The resemblance. The same determined set of the jaw, the same intelligent eyes. This was Thomas Garrett's child. The debt he thought he could never repay had just walked up and handed him a bill. He pushed himself to his feet, his gaze finding Mercer, who was watching him with a new wary respect. "Leave her alone." Frank said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You and your men. Stay away from her and her mother." Mercer hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "The colonel will want to hear about this." He and his companion backed away, melting into the shadows of a nearby alley. Frank turned his attention back to the girl. "Your name is Penny Garrett." It wasn't a question. She nodded, clutching her soldier to her chest. "How did you know?" "I knew your father," Frank said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "We served together. He was a good man, a brave man. He saved my life." Penny's eyes widened. "You really knew him for true?" "For true," Frank confirmed. "My name is Frank Sullivan." She studied him for a long moment. "My mama's been having trouble. Those bad men keep coming to our farm, saying we got to sell. Mama won't do it, but I'm scared." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mama's too proud to ask for help, but I'm not. Papa always said sometimes you gotta be brave and ask for what you need." She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "I need someone big and strong who ain't afraid of bad men. Someone who knew my papa. Will you help us, Mr. Sullivan?" Frank looked into the earnest face of Thomas Garrett's daughter and felt the weight of a decade-old promise settle upon his shoulders. He had come to Copper Ridge to meet a woman who had never existed outside of hopeful letters, a future built on a lie. But perhaps fate had a different purpose for him here. Not to build a new life for himself, but to protect the one Thomas had been forced to leave behind. "Where's your farm, Penny?" he asked, his voice softer than his size would suggest. "About a mile north of town," she replied, pointing with a dusty finger. "The one with the broken fence and the big oak tree." Frank nodded. "I think I know the one. You go on home now. Tell your mother you've invited a guest for supper. I'll be along shortly." Penny's face lit up with a triumphant smile. "You won't be sorry, Mr. Sullivan. Mama's the best cook in the territory." She darted off, then paused and looked back. "And Mr. Sullivan, bring your gun, just in case." As the little girl disappeared down the street, Frank stood for a moment, and the sun warm on his face. The purpose he had lost on the train platform a week ago had just been handed back to him, carved from wood and clutched in the hand of a 7-year-old girl. A promise was made in the heart of a battle, and here in this dusty, forgotten town was his chance to finally make it good. The Garrett homestead was a testament to stubborn resilience. The fence was indeed broken, its posts leaning at weary angles. The barn roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse, and the fields, though partially planted, were choked with the persistent weeds of the high desert. Yet the small farmhouse itself was immaculate. The windows were clean, a pot of hardy geraniums bloomed on the porch, and laundry patched but spotless fluttered on a line stretched between two ponderosa pines. Belle Garrett was hanging the last of these sheets when she saw him coming. She froze, her hand still holding a clothespin, and Frank watched as her body tensed. She moved with an economy of motion he recognized from the battlefield, reaching for the shotgun propped against the porch post without taking her eyes off him. She was a handsome woman, not in the delicate way of the ladies in Eastern magazines, but with a strength etched into her features. Her hair, the same wheat blonde as her daughter's, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her green eyes, when he got close enough to see them, were sharp with suspicion. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice clear and firm. The shotgun wasn't aimed at him, but its presence was an undeniable statement. "State your business." Frank stopped at the broken gate, removing his worn hat as a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Garrett, my name is Frank Sullivan. Your daughter Penny invited me to supper." Her eyes narrowed. "My daughter is 7 years old and has no authority to invite anyone anywhere, especially large-armed strangers who arrive unannounced." Just then the screen door banged open, and Penny burst out, her face alight with excitement. "Mama, he came. This is Mr. Sullivan. He knew Papa in the war." Penelope Jane Garrett Bell said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You are in a world of trouble. Go inside." "But Mama, he knew Papa. He saved his life." The words hung in the air. Belle's gaze shifted from her daughter to Frank, a flicker of something pain, curiosity, hope crossing her features before the mask of wary resolve settled back into place. "Penny, inside. Now." The girl's shoulders slumped, but she obeyed, casting one last pleading look at Frank before disappearing into the house. When they were alone, Belle lowered the shotgun, though she kept it cradled in her arm. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate that you knew my husband, but I'm not in the habit of entertaining strangers." "I understand, ma'am," Frank said. "I wouldn't have come, but Penny mentioned you were having trouble with men trying to get you to sell this land." Belle's jaw tightened. "I can handle my own problems." "I'm sure you can," Frank replied, his gaze taking in the broken fence, the sagging roof, the sheer amount of work that was too much for one person. "But Thomas saved my life. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay. But I can try by helping his family." "We don't need charity," she said, the words sharp as broken glass. "It's not charity, Mrs. Garrett. It's honoring a promise. To a friend." He met her gaze directly, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. "I'm a blacksmith by trade, but I can turn my hand to most things. Fences, roofs, whatever you need. In exchange, a place in your barn and a meal now and then would be more than enough while I get my father's old smithy running in town." She studied him, weighing his words, her skepticism warring with the undeniable truth of her situation. She was alone, besieged, and exhausted. This giant of a man, who spoke of her husband with reverence, was offering a solution she was too proud to ask for, but too desperate to refuse. "You really knew him?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Yes, ma'am. He was the best scout in the regiment, told the best stories around the campfire." A genuine smile touched Frank's lips. "He showed me a picture of you once. Said you were the prettiest girl in Colorado Territory and twice as stubborn." A ghost of a smile touched her own lips, the first he'd seen. It transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the young woman she must have been before. Widowhood and hardship had become her daily companions. "That sounds like Thomas." She sighed, a sound heavy with weariness. "The barn is empty and there's rabbit stew on the stove. You can wash up at the pump out back." She paused, then added, "But you should know Mr. Sullivan. It might get dangerous. The man who wants this land, Cornelius Blackthorne, He doesn't take no for an answer. I've faced worse than an angry landowner, Mrs. Garrett. Belle, she corrected him. If you're going to be sleeping in my barn, you might as well use my name. Belle, he repeated. It was a good name, a strong name. As he turned toward the pump, a shot cracked through the evening quiet. Wood splintered from the porch post inches from Belle's head. Frank reacted on pure instinct, years of combat training taking over. "Get down!" he roared, launching his massive body toward her. He covered her as they crashed to the floor of the porch, another bullet whistling through the space where they had just been standing. From inside, Penny screamed, "Stay inside!" Belle yelled, her voice steady despite the sudden terror. To Frank, she whispered Blackthorn's men. They've been doing this for a week. Warning shots, getting closer each time. Frank's jaw clenched. "Where's your shotgun?" "By the door." He crawled, keeping low, and grabbed the weapon. "How many?" "3 usually. Hidden in the trees by the road. When I move, you get inside with Penny and bolt the door," he commanded. Before she could protest, he rolled to the edge of the porch and fired a blast from the shotgun into the air. The shooting from the trees stopped, the attackers surprised by the return fire. "That's enough." Frank's voice boomed across the property, a sound that seemed to shake the very air. "The next shot finds flesh, if this is your only warning." A tense silence followed. Then a voice thin and reedy called back from the darkness. "This ain't your fight, mister, walk away." "I'm making it my fight," Frank yelled back. "Tell your colonel if he wants this land, he can come and face me like a man, not send cowardly dogs to shoot at women and children in the dark." There was a flurry of muttered conversation from the tree line, and then the sound of horses moving away at a gallop. The attack was over for now. Belle slowly got to her feet, her face pale in the twilight. "They'll be back." "Yes," Frank said, rising to his full intimidating height. "They will, and we'll be ready for them." Penny appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She looked at the splintered porch post, then at Frank, who stood solid and unmovable as an oak tree, the shotgun held loosely in one hand. "Are you staying for real?" she asked, her voice a small, hopeful whisper. Frank looked from the child to her mother, seeing the same question in Belle's guarded eyes. He thought of Thomas Garrett's face in the firelight of a Virginia battlefield, and the promise he had made to himself over the man's unseen grave. "Yes," Frank said, his gaze meeting Belle's. "I'm staying." The next few weeks fell into a new rhythm. Frank moved his meager belongings into the barn, but spent his waking hours transforming the homestead. He started with the fence, digging new post holes with an auger that seemed a toy in his massive hands, stretching wire until the boundaries of the Garrett property were once again sharp and defined. He worked with a quiet, tireless efficiency that Belle found both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He spoke little, but his actions were a constant conversation. Every mended gate, every patched roof, shingle, every cleared acre of field was a declaration of his commitment. He learned more about their adversary, Cornelius Blackthorn, from Moses Kemp, the grizzled one-legged storekeeper in town. Came here after the war with a chest full of money. Nobody can explain, Moses had told him, leaning over a sack of flour. A former Confederate colonel, eloquent, charming, and ruthless as a winter wolf. He bought the played-out silver mine for pennies and then started buying up every parcel of land along the proposed railroad route. He's got Sheriff Williams in his pocket and half the town council on his payroll. Frank confronted Mercer and his men again, this time on the open road to town. They had tried to block his wagon, their casual intimidation turning to nervous blustering, when Frank stepped down holding a heavy blacksmith's hammer in one hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told them that if he ever saw them within a mile of the Garrett farm again, he would dismantle their wagon with a hammer and them with his bare hands. They had backed down, but the encounter confirmed his fear. Blackthorn's operation was well-funded, organized, and not easily discouraged. His true focus, however, was on the farm and its small family. He found a strange contentment in the simple, hard labor. He was building something, protecting something. He carved Penny the promised horse from a piece of seasoned oak, a magnificent stallion with a flowing mane that she immediately named Thunder. At night, after the chores were done, he would sit on the porch sharpening tools or mending harnesses, while Belle read aloud to Penny by the light of a kerosene lamp. In these quiet moments, he saw the deep lines of exhaustion around Belle's eyes begin to soften. He saw the guarded caution in her posture give way to a tentative trust. She started leaving the shotgun by the door instead of carrying it with her to the laundry line. It was a small change, but it spoke volumes. One rainy afternoon, while clearing out a collapsed section of the root cellar, Frank's shovel struck something hard and metallic. It was a lockbox, rusted but intact. Belle came at his call, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I've never seen that before." It must have been buried when this section caved in years ago. Together they forced the lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. "It's Thomas's." Belle whispered, her fingers tracing the faded initials TG on the cover. His surveying notes. He was always writing in it. They took it into the warm, dry kitchen. As Belle carefully turned the brittle pages, the story of Thomas Garrett's last months before the war unfolded. Most of it was what she expected: notes on soil quality, sketches of the property, observations on weather patterns. But the last few entries were different. The handwriting was more hurried, the tone more urgent. "Listen to this," Belle said, her voice tight. "Explored the old northern tunnel of the mine today, the one the old-timers always talked about. Found something unexpected. Not silver. Something far more valuable and far more dangerous. A secret the Confederacy brought west. If my suspicions are correct, Colonel C.B. is involved." "C.B. Frank," said, his voice grim. "Cornelius Blackthorne." Belle continued, reading, her voice trembling slightly. "Have documented everything. The location, the contents. If anything happens to me, this journal is the only proof. It seems Blackthorne's interest in this valley predates the railroad by a long, long time. He is not just a businessman. He is a zealot still fighting a war that is already lost." The final entry was a single chilling sentence. "I believe he knows I've found it. I am being watched." The journal contained more than just words. Tucked into a pocket at the back was a detailed map of the mine, showing a hidden chamber off the northern tunnel. And with it, a list of name supplies and dates, a ledger detailing the creation of a secret Confederate arsenal. Thomas Garrett hadn't just stumbled upon some leftover supplies. He'd uncovered a conspiracy, a plot to continue the war from the shadows of the West, funded by a cache of stolen gold and led by Cornelius Blackthorne. Thomas wasn't just a farmer who had answered the call to duty. He had been a Union spy. The revelation settled over the small kitchen, as heavy and cold as a shroud. This wasn't a land dispute. It was a matter of treason, of murder. Thomas hadn't been a random casualty of war. He had been silenced. He knew. Belle whispered, tears streaming down her face. He knew the danger he was in, and he still went. He went to protect this. Frank said gently, his gaze sweeping the cozy kitchen, the sounds of Penny playing in the next room. "To protect you." The relative peace of the past few weeks was a lie, a temporary lull in a storm that had been gathering for over a decade. They now held the truth, a truth that Blackthorne had killed to protect. And he would surely kill again to keep it buried. The storm broke 2 nights later. It came not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet thud of muffled hooves and the sinister flicker of torchlight against the newly repaired barn. Frank was awake instantly, his soldier's senses screaming a warning. He grabbed his rifle and was moving before Belle had even called his name. "They're here," she said from the doorway of her room, the shotgun already in her hands. More than before. Through the window, Frank could see at least a dozen riders fanning out their objective, clear they were here for the journal, and they would burn the farm to the ground to get it. "Get Penny to the root cellar," Frank commanded, his voice calm and steady. "Bar the door from the inside. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Frank, you can't face them all alone." "I won't be," he said grimly. He looked at the shotgun in her hands. "You know how to use that." She nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Godspeed, Frank." He slipped out the back door as the first torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the barn. The structure, his pride and hard work, went up in a whoosh of flame. Anger, cold and pure, surged through him. He used the distraction of the fire to circle around, taking up a position behind the stone wall of the spring house. From there, he had a clear line of sight to the men advancing on the house. The first shot came from the house itself, Belle firing from an upstairs window, forcing the attackers to take cover. Frank used the opportunity to take aim. He wasn't shooting to kill, not yet. He aimed for a leg, a shoulder. His first shot sent a man sprawling with a cry of pain. His second knocked another from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Blackthorn's men, expecting a simple raid against a lone woman, found themselves in a coordinated crossfire. A familiar voice cut through the gunfire. "He's over there by the spring house." It's the giant Jake Mercer. Several riders wheeled their horses, charging Frank's position. He fired again, dropping the lead horse. The animal went down in a tangle of limbs, sending its rider flying and blocking the path of the others. But they were too many. They were going to overrun him. As he reloaded, a stray piece of information from Thomas's journal clicked into place. A mention of Blackthorn's younger brother, a captain who had served under his command. The journal entry was brief. CB's brother fell at the Wilderness. Some say the colonel has never recovered. His rage is a personal thing. The Wilderness. The battle where Thomas had died. The battle where Frank had almost died. He remembered the charge through the burning woods, his unit pushing back a determined Confederate line. He had been at the forefront, his size making him a terrifying and conspicuous target. He remembered a young Confederate officer, blond and fiercely brave, rallying his men, a silver locket glinting at his throat. Frank had engaged him directly, a brutal close-quarters fight that had ended with the officer falling to Frank's bayonet. Mercer's voice cut through his memory again, this time, laced with a fanatical rage. "This is for Captain Blackthorn, the one you killed at the Wilderness, Sullivan, the colonel's brother." The pieces slammed together with sickening force. It wasn't just about the gold. It wasn't just about Thomas. It was about him. Blackthorn hadn't just been hunting for the man who discovered his secret. He'd been hunting for the Union giant who had killed his beloved younger brother. And Thomas Garrett had been the man who led Frank to him. The vendetta was a twisted, three-sided thing, a decade-old knot of vengeance. And Frank was standing right in the middle of it. The realization didn't bring fear, only a cold, hard clarity. This ended tonight. One way or another. He abandoned the cover of the spring house, charging forward with a roar that was more animal than human. He was no longer just a protector repaying a debt. He was a target, a ghost from a past Blackthorn had tried to bury, and he would make them pay for digging him up. He fired his last round, then used the heavy rifle as a club, swinging it with devastating force. The fight devolved into a brutal, primitive melee in the flickering firelight of the burning barn. The siege was relentless. With the barn reduced to a skeleton of charred timbers, Blackthorn's men pressed their attack on the house. Frank, fighting with a primal fury fueled by the night's revelations, had managed to drive back the initial assault. But he was wounded, a deep gash on his forearm from a knife and a collection of bruises that would make movement and agony later. More importantly, they were trapped. At least 10 of Blackthorn's men had encircled the property, their torchlight painting a flickering, hellish perimeter. "We can't stay here," Frank said, pressing a strip of cloth from Belle's apron against his bleeding arm. They were huddled in the kitchen, the windows barricaded with furniture. "They'll wait until dawn and then burn the house around us." Belle's face was grim, smudged with soot from the shotgun blasts she'd fired out the window. "There's nowhere to go. They have the road covered." "Not the road." Frank set his mind racing, connecting the dots from Thomas's journal. The mine. Thomas's map showed an old air shaft on the north side of the hill leading out to the creek. Belle's eyes widened. I know the place. It's little more than a fissure in the rock hidden by overgrown brush. Can you and Penny fit through it? Yes, but you... Her gaze traveled over his massive shoulders. Frank, you'll never make it. I'll make it, he said with a certainty he didn't feel. It's our only chance. He looked toward the trap door in the floor that led to the root cellar. We get Penny go out the back and make a run for the hillside under the cover of darkness. The smoke from the barn will help hide us. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Belle nodded her trust in him, absolute. She retrieved a terrified but blessedly silent Penny from the cellar. The child clutched her wooden soldier Storm, her eyes wide, as she took in the chaos of the barricaded kitchen. Frank knelt before her. Penny, we're going to play a game. The quiet game. We have to be as silent as mice and follow me and your mother. Can you do that? She nodded solemnly, her small face a mask of determination that was pure Thomas Garrett. The escape was a nightmare of shadows and fear. They moved low and fast, the smoke from the dying embers of the barn stinging their eyes and lungs. Twice they had to freeze as patrols passed nearby, their voices carrying on the night air. Frank's body screamed in protest, but he pushed on, half carrying Penny, while Belle moved ahead, her knowledge of the land guiding them through the darkness. They reached the wooded hillside and began the treacherous climb. The entrance to the air shaft was exactly where Belle remembered it, a dark, uninviting slit in the rock face. Go, Frank urged. I'll hold them off if they follow. Belle hesitated, her hand resting for a moment on his uninjured arm. Be careful, Frank. Then she and Penny squeezed into the opening and were gone. Frank waited rifle ready, listening to the sounds of the men still circling the house. He heard a shout they had discovered the empty house. Soon they would find their trail. He backed into the shaft, the rock scraping against his shoulders, forcing him to move sideways. It was a tight, claustrophobic passage. And for a terrifying moment, he thought Belle had been right, that he was too large to pass. He exhaled, making himself smaller, and pushed through the stone, tearing at his clothes and skin. He followed the narrow shaft as it descended into the earth, emerging into the cold, silent darkness of the main mine tunnel. Belle's lantern cast a small pool of golden light a few yards ahead. They're coming, he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. We need to get to the other side of the hill. As if on cue, a deep rumbling boom shook the mine. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. An explosion. Belle said, her voice tight with fear. They've collapsed the main entrance. They were sealed in. Blackthorn wasn't just trying to trap them. He was trying to bury them, to entomb the last witnesses to his crimes. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm them. But Frank's voice cut through it, a bedrock of calm in the chaos. The air shaft on the other side. The one leading to the creek. We can still make it. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence of the mine. The lantern beam danced wildly, revealing rotting timbers and the ghostly skeletons of abandoned ore carts. Another explosion, closer this time, shook the very foundations of the mountain. A massive support beam splintered and crashed to the tunnel floor just behind them, sending up a cloud of choking dust. They were being systematically entombed. They reached a fork in the tunnel. Which way? Frank yelled. The map, Belle cried, fumbling in the satchel where she had stuffed the journal. She spread the brittle paper on the ground. By the flickering lantern light, she traced the path with a trembling finger. Left, it should lead to the northern tunnels. They plunged into the darkness again, and the air growing colder, the sound of their own frantic breathing loud in their ears. It was a race against a deliberate, calculating malice, a race against the mountain itself. Frank knew that even if they found the exit, their ordeal was far from over. Blackthorn would be waiting. He wouldn't leave anything to chance. The final confrontation was not a matter of if, but when. And it would not happen in the familiar territory of the farm. but here in the cold, dead heart of the earth, or in whatever broken landscape lay beyond it. They found the exit, another narrow shaft that smelled of damp earth and moss. Frank pushed Belle and Penny through, first, then followed, emerging bruised and battered into the pre-dawn grayness on the far side of the hill. They were free of the mine, but they were still trapped in the valley. "We have to get to town," Belle whispered, her voice raw. "To the sheriff." "Williams is in Blackthorn's pocket," Frank reminded her grimly. "He'll be no help. We need to get out of the valley to the county seat at Silver Creek." It was a 20-mile trek over rough country. As the first rays of sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged peaks in hues of blood and rust, they started walking. But they hadn't gone more than a mile when the sound of horses reached them. It was Mercer and 3 other men riding a patrol route around the base of the hill. They were spotted. The chase was short and brutal. Frank tried to make a stand to buy Belle and Penny time, but in the open on foot and with only a few rounds left for his rifle, he was no match for 4 mounted men. They were surrounded, captured their desperate flight, ending in the dust and sagebrush of the valley floor. "The colonel is very eager to see you all," Mercer said, his smile a triumphant slash across his face. "Especially you, Giant." They were taken not to the farm, but to town. The streets of Copper Ridge were eerily quiet, the windows of the houses like vacant eyes. A powerful dust storm was brewing in the west, the sky a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind beginning to howl, whipping dust and grit into the air. Mercer herded them into the town's main saloon. It was empty save for one man sitting at a table in the back, calmly sipping a glass of whiskey. Cornelius Blackthorn rose as they entered. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, a stark contrast to their ragged, dirt-stained appearance. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice smooth and educated, "and the lovely Mrs. Garrett. I am so pleased you could join me. Please have a seat." His politeness was more menacing than any threat. "What do you want, Blackthorn?" Frank demanded, placing himself protectively in front of Belle and Penny. "What I have always wanted," Blackthorn replied. "The journal, and a final settling of accounts." His eyes cold and gray as a winter sky fixed on Frank. "You took something from me in the wilderness, Sullivan. My brother. My legacy. You and Thomas Garrett, the traitor, he was conspired to ruin me." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and sending dust puffing through the cracks in the floorboards. The air in the saloon grew thick, claustrophobic. "Your brother died in a war you started," Frank said, his voice low and dangerous. "And Thomas Garrett was a hero." Blackthorn laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Semantics. The point is, you are the last loose ends." He nodded to Mercer. The thin man grabbed Penny, pulling her away from her mother. Belle screamed, but another man held her back. Mercer pressed the barrel of his pistol to the child's temple. "The journal, Mrs. Garrett," Blackthorn said, his voice losing none of its calm. "Or your daughter's introduction to progress will be far more abrupt than I had planned." The climax was not a clash of armies, but a battle of wills in a dust-choked room. Belle, tears streaming down her face, looked at Frank, her eyes pleading. Frank's mind raced. He had to end this now. "Let the girl go, Blackthorn," Frank said, taking a slow step forward. "Your fight is with me." "Indeed it is," Blackthorn agreed. "But I find a bit of leverage so very clarifying." Frank looked at the man, at the mask of aristocratic control, and he remembered the detail from Thomas's journal. Asterisk, his rage is a personal thing. He saw the silver locket around Blackthorn's neck, the one Mercer had mentioned his captain wore. "He was brave," Frank said, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "Your brother. I remember him. He didn't back down even at the end. He died with honor." Blackthorn's composure flickered. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Do not speak his name." He rallied his men when they were broken. Frank continued, taking another step. "He looked me in the eye. He wasn't afraid. You would have been proud of him." "Silence," Blackthorn roared, his mask of civility finally shattering. The rage Thomas had written about was now on full display. "Does it eat at you?" Colonel Frank pressed his voice, a relentless whisper. "That you were safe behind the lines, while your little brother was on the front, that you sent him to die." It was the final straw. With a guttural cry of fury, Blackthorne drew his own ornate pistol and fired at Frank. The shot went wide the colonel's hand, shaking with rage. In that split second of distraction, everything happened at once. Frank launched himself forward, not at Blackthorne, but at Mercer. He slammed into the smaller man, his massive frame sending them both crashing into a table. The pistol flew from Mercer's grasp, clattering across the floor. Penny Freed scrambled toward her mother. Belle, no longer restrained, grabbed a heavy whiskey bottle from the bar and brought it down on the head of the man who had been holding her. He crumpled to the floor. The saloon erupted into a maelstrom of violence. Gunshots cracked, wood splintered, and the thick, choking dust turned the world into a swirling brown nightmare of shadows and shouts. Visibility was near zero. Frank, fighting on pure instinct, found one of Blackthorne's men in the gloom and dispatched him with a single brutal punch. Through the haze, he saw Blackthorne, a phantom in the dust, taking aim at Belle and Penny as they huddled behind the overturned bar. Frank roared and charged a bull seeing red. Blackthorne turned and fired. The bullet seared a path across Frank's ribs, a white-hot poker of pain. But it didn't stop him. He crashed into the colonel, sending them both tumbling to the floor. They wrestled in the dust, two ghosts from an old war settling a final personal score. Blackthorne was surprisingly strong, wiry, and desperate, but Frank's sheer size and strength were overwhelming. He pinned the colonel to the floor, his hand closing around the man's throat. "It's over," Frank rasped his breath, coming in ragged gasps. The saloon doors burst open, and a figure stood silhouetted against the swirling dust outside. Sheriff Williams, a shotgun in his hands, followed by Moses Kemp and a half-dozen armed townsmen. Shamed into action, at last. Blackthorne looked past Frank at the armed men, at the ruin of his plans, and something inside him seemed to break. His body went limp, the fight draining out of him. Defeated, the dust began to settle, revealing the wreckage of the saloon. Two of Blackthorne's men were down, another was nursing a broken arm, and Mercer was groaning on the floor. It was over. Truly over. Belle rushed to Frank's side, her hands fluttering over the bloody tear in his shirt. "Frank, you're hurt." He looked at her, at Penny clinging to her skirts, safe and sound, and the pain in his side seemed a small price to pay. "It's just a scratch," he said, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the weight of the past finally, irrevocably begin to lift. In the immediate aftermath, the town of Copper Ridge seemed to awaken from a long, fearful slumber. Sheriff Williams, his face a mask of grim determination, formally arrested Mercer and Blackthorne's other surviving men. Cornelius Blackthorne himself was placed in a cell under heavy guard, his aristocratic arrogance replaced by a venomous, simmering silence. Doc Henley, summoned from his office, bustled into the wrecked saloon, clucking his tongue at the state of things before efficiently tending to Frank's wounds and the various injuries of the other combatants. "You have the devil's own luck, Sullivan," the doctor muttered as he stitched the gash on Frank's side. "An inch to the left, and this would be a very different conversation." Frank merely grunted, his gaze fixed on Belle, who stood nearby with Penny watching him with an expression of profound relief. And something deeper, something that made his heart beat a little faster than the pain medication warranted. The community, which had for so long bent to Blackthorne's will, now rallied around the Garretts. The women of the town descended on the farmhouse, cleaning up the damage from the raid. The men, led by Moses Kemp, began organizing work parties to clear the debris of the burned barn and make plans for a new one. The truth, once revealed, had acted as a cleansing fire. A few months later, news arrived via the town's small weekly paper. Cornelius Blackthorne had been tried in a federal court in Denver. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of Thomas Garrett's journal, Frank's testimony, and his own men turning against him in exchange for leniency, he was found guilty of treason murder and a litany of other crimes. His sentence was life in a federal penitentiary. His ill-gotten empire was dismantled, his assets seized, and his hold over Copper Ridge was broken for good. The farm now officially and irrevocably, the Garrett-Sullivan farm, was thriving. With Frank's strength and skill combined with Belle's deep knowledge of the land, the fields produced a bumper crop. The new barn stood proud and strong, a symbol of the community's resilience. Frank and Belle were partners in every sense of the word, their quiet courtship having blossomed into a deep and abiding love, forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. On a warm autumn afternoon, the day they received the final news of Blackthorn's sentencing, then they walked to the small private cemetery on a hill overlooking the farm. Thomas Garrett's grave, once marked by a simple wooden cross, now bore a proper headstone of carved granite. Frank stood before it for a long moment, the silence broken only by the rustle of aspen leaves in the breeze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small faded object, his Union campaign medal, a simple bronze star he hadn't looked at in 10 years. He leaned down and placed it carefully on the stone base of the headstone. A final silent act. The debt was paid. The promise was kept. As he straightened up, Belle slipped her hand into his. Her touch was warm, comforting a connection that anchored him to the present, to the future. He looked at her, at the love shining in her green eyes, and at Penny, who was laying a small bouquet of wildflowers on her father's grave. His past was honored, his ghosts were at peace, and his future was standing right beside him. As they turned to walk back toward the house, their hands linked, Belle paused. She looked up at him, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. "Frank," she said, her voice soft, but filled with a radiant joy. "There's something you should know. The doctor confirmed it this morning." She placed his free hand on her stomach. "We're going to need a bigger house. The 3 of us are going to become 4. Frank stared at her, then down at his hand, resting on the gentle curve of her abdomen, and a wave of pure, unadulterated happiness washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. A new life, a new beginning. A symbol that hope, like the stubborn wildflowers on the prairie, could always find a way to bloom, even after the harshest of storms. He pulled her close, his giant's embrace, gentle and sure, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he was finally truly home.